Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Skoll. I am the president of the Venezuelan American Association of the U.S., VAUS. I would like to welcome all of you today to today's discussion on the role of the private sector in mitigating the humanitarian crisis. First of all, heartfelt thanks to our panel members, Mariela Poleo, Maria Moreno, Scarlett Cronin, as well as our moderator, Felipe Munoz, for taking their time to be with us. Also, thank you all for attending. The Venezuelan American Association has been promoting exchange between Venezuela and the US for 85 years. During this unprecedented crisis, VAUS has done its utmost to provide information to foster discussion and spark action, hopefully toward the transformation of the country from today's brutal dictatorship to a democracy which respects human rights and ends support to and from guerrillas, terrorist groups, and drug traffickers. We thank you all for accompanying us on our quest for knowledge and for a better future for Venezuela. Now I would like to introduce our moderator. Felipe Munoz is a Colombian who knows a great deal about the Venezuelan crisis and has been a key part of Colombia's remarkable, generous response to it. Colombia's response to the Venezuelan humanitarian crisis deserves a series, a novel, a lot of other things. We don't have time to go deeply into it at all today, but it is a major high good point in the recent history of Latin America. Since August 2020, Felipe has served as head of the migration unit of the Inter-American Development Bank. Previously, he was the presidential advisor for the border between Colombia and Venezuela and coordinated the government response to the migratory flow from Venezuela at the national and local levels, as well as the related efforts of cooperators, international actors, and organizations of civil society. Previously, he was a senior advisor to the board of executive directors of the Inter-American Development Bank. His extensive experience in the Colombian public sector includes having been superintendent of surveillance and private security, director of the National Intelligence Agency, and advisor to the Mayor's Office of Bogotá and the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit. He is a graduate of the Externado de Colombia University, where he obtained a BA in Finance and International Relations, and the London School of Economics and Political Science in the UK, where he obtained a master's in urban and regional planning. Since our program will conclude with a Q&A section, you may write questions at any time using the chat button at the bottom of the page, and our moderator will read from them as many as possible for the panelists. And now I turn the program over to Felipe, who will introduce the panelists and begin the conversation. Felipe. Felipe, turn on your microphone.
Yes, after 1 year, okay. Michael, thank you very much for you and all your team at the BAS, and thank you for this invitation. It's really an honor to be here. And it is maybe just to begin, it's needless to say in this panel how deep is the crisis in Venezuela. More than 5.8 million Venezuelans have fled their country in the last 5 years, causing the second largest migration crisis in the world nowadays after the Syrian crisis. And of course, addressing these exceptional circumstances needs the joint effort from the public and the private sector. We want to acknowledge the commitment and solidarity from many governments, of course, Colombia, but also other governments in the regions, as Ecuador, as Peru, as Costa Rica, as too many other countries that have received the Venezuelan migrants and refugees and trying just to integrate them into the society. But it's not enough, the public sector commitment. We need the private sector and the civil society. And in that matter, we launched as a migration unit in the IDB, what was, as we call, Mignovation, which is like a more active and innovative participation of the private sector and civil society to support government's effort and take advantage of the millions of opportunities that migrants and refugees represents. Like what? That, for example, they bring skills demanded by companies and organizations. They increase the innovation capacity of the countries. They create successful ventures that generate employment opportunities. They are a bridge of knowledge and opportunities, but also they are younger and also sometimes well prepared than some of the natives people in the countries. And just to discuss what are some of the specific actions that have been taken by the private sector, the philanthropic initiatives and the partnerships to mitigate the crisis, I have the honor to present the panelists. First of all, Mariela Poleo is the currently manager and president of the Simón Bolívar Foundation, which is the nonprofit for Citgo Petroleum Company. She had led several processes to provide immediate access to resources to help mitigate COVID-19 in Venezuela, and has promoted a move towards becoming an organization that award grants to NGOs and launching several initiatives in Venezuela and Latin America. Also with us is Scarlett Cronin, is the acting executive director of the 10th Partnership for Refugees, a business coalition of more than 170 major companies stepping up for refugees. She also serves as senior director of partnership of 10th, and also she worked for Hamdi Ulukaya, which is one of the most inspiring people in this process regarding migration and refugees. And finally, we are joined Maria Moreno, is the head of operations of the private sector engagement and philanthropy of USA for International Organization of Migration. She works with the private and philanthropic sector in the United States to raise awareness and mobilize investment and resources that support IUN programs around the world. Welcome all of you, and thank you for being with here today. And to kick off the first questions, I think we are going to begin. Begin with the first question to Scarlett. Scarlett, can you tell us a little bit about TENT? What is the role that you think the private sector can play in supporting refugees and migrants around the world? And if you have any experience in Latin America.
Yes, thank you so much, Felipe, and thank you so much to the organizers for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be here and joining such esteemed panelists for this conversation. So really appreciate it. And yeah, to kick things off, would love to share a little bit about TENT and who we are and what we do. So we are a very non-traditional foundation set up, Felipe, as you were mentioning, by Hamdi Ulukaya, who's the CEO of Chobani Yogurt, a company hopefully many of you know. And Hamdi, for years, has hired refugees and immigrants at his factories here in the US. And he did it really because he needed workers. It wasn't for political or humanitarian reasons, but he quickly saw just what dedication, loyalty, motivation, ambition refugees and immigrants brought to the company. And it really has been such an important part of the success story in terms of Chobani becoming one of the fastest food growing companies here in the US. And from that vantage point, he wanted to encourage other businesses around the world to step up for refugees. So he launched TENT back in 2016 with 10 companies. As you mentioned, we are now a coalition of more than 170 major businesses, ranging from OXXO to Airbnb to MasterCard to Philips to Virgin. It's really a diverse group of companies that we have in our network. And all of these companies are taking steps in support of refugees. And I think we will spend quite a bit of time today, of course, discussing the very important role that philanthropy can play and must play in such a massive humanitarian crisis as we are seeing caused by the Venezuelan exodus. But we at TENT really also believe that companies can go a step beyond philanthropy. As you mentioned earlier, refugees and migrants bring huge opportunity to the countries that they come to, but they also need a chance to succeed. And we think that businesses can play the most sustainable and impactful role if they think about their strengths and qualities as a company. So thinking about hiring refugees, supporting refugee entrepreneurs, tailoring products and services to meet refugee needs. These are the sorts of activities that we work with companies on. And we are global, we work around the world, but for the past few years have had a very big focus and emphasis on on supporting Venezuelans and others who are displaced in the region, just in response to the huge need that there is. So we're working in Colombia. Of course, Felipe, we had the opportunity to travel with you to the Venezuelan border a couple of years ago. We're in Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, several of the countries that are most impacted, and working in a very hands-on way with companies to help them figure out how to hire Venezuelans, really bring them into the workforce, support refugee entrepreneurs. And I'd be happy to share a little bit more in the discussion, but that's just a brief overview of who we are and what we're doing in the region. I think you're on mute.
Again, sorry, no, this is a good starting point just to hear about what is the as an NGO perspective working with the private sector. But why don't we move to the private sector? And Mariela, you're here representing the private sector. Can you share with us the strategy that the Simón Bolívar Foundation has to contribute to try to help in mitigate the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela and the region due to this migration issue? How is the Simón Bolívar trying to help it?
Yes, thank you very much for having me here. And likewise, it's been it's a pleasure to be with the panelists that are joining me today. This is a very interesting topic about how the humanitarian, the private sector, the private sector can help mitigate the humanitarian crisis. And I'll share a little bit the story of the Simón Bolívar Foundation. The Simón Bolívar Foundation is a nonprofit for Citgo Petroleum Corporation. As many corporations, of course, we do support and influence the communities where we have activities and where the headquarters are based, but also the ultimate shareholder for Citgo is Venezuela. And with that in mind, the Simón Bolívar Foundation was created many years ago. When it was created focused mostly on providing support to individual patients that were in need of treatments that were not at one time but that with the deterioration of the health system in Venezuela, they were not able to receive the treatment in Venezuela. So in 2019, with the new board of directors in Citgo and in the foundation, the foundation board evaluated what was the performance and how could, given the humanitarian crisis that Venezuela was going through, how could the foundation be a more active player and how could we create more impact? With that in mind, then we revised the vision of the foundation with the focus of providing health to vulnerable population in and out of Venezuela that has been affected by disaster, poverty, and conflicts, and mostly concentrated into mothers and children. With that, last year, then, it was the year where we did the transition in terms of individual grants to grant making to NGOs. And we had several successful rounds. I will be happy to talk a little bit more about this during the conversation, but we managed to launch several rounds that helped individuals in Venezuela and also in the region, concentrated in COVID-19 and also in other health issues. What is important to mention also is that we also think that there's a very important role about raising awareness of the situation in Venezuela. And with that, we also organized several webinars last year that were related to COVID-19 and also the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. And last but not least, I think it's important to mention also that we see that we work with NGOs that provide the support in Venezuela. And we believe that training of these NGOs is very important also, so we can help go through the humanitarian crisis. So we also provided training to the grantees that we have, and we see it also as a multiplying factor where we're not only providing training for the grantees working with us, but they would be able also to apply to grants in other organizations and then obtain more funds to support the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela.
Thank you, Mariela. And in this first part, we are going to hear from our panelists the more general strategy of each of one institutions, but later on, we are going to move into more details and example how the private sector, the philanthropics can step up and helping in this biggest challenge. We have the Q&A process open for everyone that wants just to pose the questions. We are going later to read some of the questions. And I'm going to turn to Maria. Maria, you work for a UN agency, the most important UN agency for migration, of course, with UNHCR as well for refugees. You have a lot of experience working. What is exactly your role? What is USA and IOM, and how you can help the UN interagency response to Venezuela displacement? How is this relationship between a UN agency, United Nations agency, with the private sector and the philanthropic sector?
Thank you, Felipe. Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon. Thank you for the audience for joining. I am very honored to be part of this panel and, of course, introduce the work that we are doing at USA for IOM and how we've been able to work with private sector and private philanthropy to support the Venezuela response. So I represent as a head of operations of USA for IOM. It's a nonprofit created here in the United States, established more than 30 years ago to mobilize or action from the American people to IOM's programs worldwide. And we've been doing that quite successfully in the past 30 years, but more proactively in the last 10. And what we do is we really have, for those that don't know much about the International Organization for Migration, the largest UN organization dealing with migration, but also internal displacement and human mobility in general. IOM is a very very large organization dealing with a lot of issues around the world in more than 150 countries. So of course, we needed to prioritize in the United States and how we really saw or kind of understood what the American people wanted to support or wished that kind of goes with their values, their own altruism and philanthropy. So we prioritize the work we do at USA for IOM in 3 areas of response. We work with people or to support people fleeing conflict and complex emergencies, massive displacement due to man-made disasters, if we wanna call it like that. The other very important thematic area that we're working, and of course is taking much more interest or priority right now, it's the climate change and the effects and climate-induced migration and displacement. And we do that with several partners here in the United States to mobilize really more resources for adaptation and disaster response. And then the last area that we work on is everything that it's people fleeing enslavement. And that means, victims of trafficking, victims of abuse, very vulnerable populations, and working to assist them in different and various complex situations. So that's USA for IOM in a nutshell. Of course, there is a role that we have taken very proactively in supporting IOM's response to the Venezuela displacement. We, of course, as you might all know, we work jointly in this response with the UNHCR. I think it's a very commendable coordination that 2 UN agencies were asked by the Secretary General, the UN Secretary General, to fulfill a very important and challenging situation. And how USA for IOM works on responding to the Venezuela displacement is really, 1, mobilize awareness of what's going on in 17 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. So we focus a lot on integration and integration initiatives that are needed, much more than the sources of the displacement. So we are working, as you all may know, there's a platform created called R4V that info, where we have all the trends, we have all the information about where in what countries, what are the sectors that we are addressing, from health to education to integration, assistance, immediate assistance, capacity building for government. So USA for IOM has really dedicated its it's work to work with the private sector in a shared value approach and see where we really are sharing an interest and see how we can mobilize the private sector and private philanthropy to join the efforts, very commendable efforts that the governments that are hosting Venezuelans are doing. However, they have surpassed their capacities, and as my fellow speakers have addressed, it is very important to bring other stakeholders into the table.
Thank you very much, Maria. And as for the Inter-American Development Bank, as a multilateral development bank, also we have a role in this process of private sector. Here with me is Alison Elias from my team, who leads all the involvement of the migration and the private sector. We were also joined with the colleagues in the BID Lab that have launched the Better Together Challenge, which is like a contest where you can apply with some innovative ideas how you can involve and create involvement of the migrants and refugees in the solutions for the process. And also we are working with the American Business Dialogue, trying to create among the private sector community more awareness about what is happening with the migration in the region, because in not only the Venezuelan crisis, we have another challenges in the region. But now you have seen that we have an NGO, we have a United Nations organization, you have a multilateral development bank, but also you have a private company. And you have heard about the general role, but why don't we go more deeper into the examples? Scarlett, can you share with us some examples that you want to share about how the companies can work with refugees? What is and why this is good for companies? What they can take in from the refugees and for the involvement of the refugees and migrants?
Yes, absolutely. So I mean, Felipe, you summed up the pretty dire statistics earlier of almost 6 million Venezuelans displaced throughout the region, a huge number. And as you mentioned, I mean, almost surpassing the Syrian refugee crisis, which is, the numbers are comparable, but just a little bit higher. But of course, the Venezuelan crisis is in a shorter amount of time. So when we look at some of the barriers in the region that exist for Venezuelans, I think there are some very specific and practical ways that companies can step up. So for example, we know that 50% of working Venezuelans in both Colombia and Peru are making less than the minimum wage. In addition, their skill sets are underutilized. You were mentioning earlier that the skills that the Venezuelans bring to their new host countries. So just to kind of paint what that looks like, only 1/6 of refugees, of Venezuelans in the region are working in the industries that they were previously working in Venezuela. So they're taking jobs that don't really match their skill sets, and they're not at the moment really able to contribute in the way that I think they would both like to and would be most beneficial for their local communities. Then one other stat to point out is that Venezuelans have very limited access to banking. We all know the challenges that can create, for any of us. So only 15% of Venezuelans, for example, in Colombia have access to banking at the moment. So these are some of the sorts of challenges that Venezuelans face. And at the same time, the business community has such a unique and important role to play to address some of these issues when it comes to hiring refugees, to encouraging their networks to hire refugees, but also in terms of access to banking. So just a couple of examples that I want to share as maybe food for thought and some inspiration. The first is Teleperformance. So Teleperformance is a major multinational company headquartered in France, operations all throughout the world, a leader in BPO, business process outsourcing, which is a jargony term, but basically if we think about call centers, which is a growing industry in Colombia, as I know you know well, Teleperformance has a sizable operation in Colombia, about 40,000 employees, and they see a huge amount of attrition. It's an industry that often sees turnover, and they've been hiring Venezuelans for several years and have seen just incredible benefits to bringing them into the business. Venezuelans are staying on the job. They, of course, bring their language skills to the country. So they're really contributing in a very, very practical and meaningful way to the business. Teleperformance has already hired 2,000 Venezuelans and is doing so on basically a daily basis, is what they tell us. And they have plans to hire many more, over the next few years. And I have to agree with what Michael said earlier, just in terms of the very commendable leadership step that Colombia has taken to regularizing status for Venezuelans in Colombia. It makes it so much easier for businesses like Teleperformance to be able to very swiftly and legally hire Venezuelans. So that's just one example in terms of a company that is hiring and seeing huge benefits. But then also when we think about this challenge about access to banking, as mentioned, it is very difficult for Venezuelans traditionally to open bank accounts throughout the region. And so Banca Mia, which is an entity of BBVA, the very large Spanish bank, has taken steps to address this, specifically by providing access to credit and making it easier for Venezuelans to open bank accounts. So what they did is they said first, what is stopping Venezuelans from being able to open bank accounts, and found, and this is the same in other countries too, this is not only in Colombia, but found that their kind of normal standard operating procedures, the regulations they have, the requirements they have are very stringent and really impossible for Venezuelans who have just come to a country to be able to, let's say, prove their credit history. That's just not going to be possible. So BBVA, through Banca Mia, said, okay, let's of course keep, we have to keep some of our requirements in place, but let's make it a little bit easier to check credit history or to see how risky a business might be that we would extend a line of credit to. So they just made some modifications, some adjustments to their usual processes. So they now have granted or made it easier for nearly 5,000 Venezuelans as kind of a first pilot to open bank accounts. About 1,000 of those entrepreneurs are getting access to credit. That also means, by the way, that Banca Mia has a new customer line. They have new clients that they're working with who will be doing business with them hopefully in the future as well. So they're both allowing Venezuelans to contribute to the local economy, to grow their businesses or start their businesses, but they are also in return seeing a new set of potential clients and customers who will be with them hopefully for the long term. So those are two examples that I want to share. But the good news is that we are seeing a lot of engagement from the private sector throughout the region to be stepping up in this sort of way.
Thank you, Scarlett, for bringing out these examples. And financial inclusion is one of the areas that the private sector can help in us in integrating migrants, but also because this is a good business. It's not only philanthropy. It's not only because this is the right thing to do, but also because this is a good business. Some of the companies from the financial sector have gained a lot of experience, not only in other regions of the world, integrated the migrants and refugees into their processes. And I think these examples give me the opportunity just to move maybe to Mariela. How do you see are the examples? Do you have any stories, specific examples that you want to share with us from you as a Simon Bolivar Foundation or another foundation and NGOs that can help in the philanthropic way, just to help in the migrants, refugees to integrate and to work with the private sector and with the NGO sector?
Yes, well, I don't think that I have any specific examples about how to integrate into work. Most of the work that the foundation does is towards grants to help improve the health system. I could tell you some examples if you want of what we're doing, if that would be useful. No?
Please, go ahead.
Okay, because I would like to use the time to talk a little bit about how the organizations or the nonprofit, the private sector has to be, when implementing programs in countries like Venezuela, have to be very nimble, very agile, and be able to change. No? When I started with the foundation last year, I started in March, just 1 week before we were all sent to work from home. And the foundation had a plan for grant giving, focus on health issues in Venezuela, but the COVID was something that was not in the agenda. And we had to provide an immediate response. Venezuela, we all know that the health situation is in crisis, and the fear that we had was that the government would not be able to provide all the tools to fight the COVID on time. No? So the first thing we did is that we launched an emergency relief fund, where we activated grantees that had already been vetted in our system. They had gone through the due diligence process, and we requested them to present specific projects to support mitigate the COVID. And with that, we were able to activate 3 grantees with, I believe it was 5 projects where we awarded more than $150,000 to provide mostly personal protection equipment for hospitals in Venezuela, and also to provide other projects that will help mitigate COVID. No? And that became a theme during last year, of course. We dedicated, following the success of this emergency relief fund, we called we did an open call for proposal where small grants were awarded to organizations that help mitigate the COVID-19 in Venezuela. And it was interesting to see the variety of projects that we received. We received projects that went from implementing a telemedicine line that helped diagnose the symptoms of COVID, and in order to alleviate the workload in the hospitals, to providing support for nutrition, given that the quarantines were so strict. One of the fears was that the individuals or the kids that were at school were not receiving the food that they needed. So that was one of the projects that we received. Also, we had additional personal protection equipment. The numbers for the medical professionals that got sick in Venezuela were higher than the rest of the region because they did not receive all the PPE that was needed. So with the different initiatives that we had, we awarded more than $600,000 in total in Venezuela. And we also had another initiative, which I think it's interesting to mention, because the COVID affected not only the Venezuelans in Venezuela, but also them in other countries in the region, like Colombia, where we funded a program for providing meals to Venezuelan migrants, but also the people here in the US. Venezuelan migrants may not have access to the funds given by the government here, and they were in need also of some support. No? And on the other side, restaurants that have been affected by the crisis, especially in the first month of COVID last year, were without work, and they had still to pay their expenses. So we defined this project called Hoy Invita Simón, where we helped different organizations provide meals to Venezuelan diaspora in need through 8 cities in the US. And part of the program was to help these restaurants. Most of the contractors were Venezuelan-owned restaurants that were helping providing the food. So it's a little bit of, I think, examples of how we were agile and moved ahead. And this is something that continues to be enforced. Last year, we also saw as implementing programs in Venezuela became more and more challenging. The NGOs were subject to harassment, and new regulations came in place that make more difficult for organizations, especially US organizations, to provide funds in Venezuela. No? So that has led us to think, how can we continue to provide support in a safe manner, and of course, complying with all laws and regulation. So 2021 has brought us to thinking that we need to expand our scope of work, not only to Venezuela, but to the region. So we're working also with some projects in Colombia right now.
With your answer, you give me 3 opportunities to mention 3 things. The first one is that you also have to consider the origin of the countries. Then your work inside Venezuela is also important, because there are so many people still there, and we don't want just that the people have to move. And the second one is that also working in the humanitarian side is also really important, because if you are talking about refugees opportunities, working opportunities, if they don't have the most basic situation, they can go to the next step, which is really, really, really important. Then why don't we move to Maria? Maria, you have a lot of examples of working with companies, but you mentioned when we were preparing this conversation that you want us to share with us the example of Cities Foundation. How the Citibank is involved in this process, how this foundation is helping the process, and what can we learn about this experience.
Thank you, Felipe. Yeah, I remember when we launched this project back in 2019, and when you were in your role in Colombia, and you know, just from there, we've learned so much from you know, the spirit of philanthropy of many other partners, but of course a remarkable one is Citi Foundation. Just to go back before going to the example, I wanted to say something about how important it has been to do my job here at USA for IOM in the United States, having, you know, the interagency coordination mechanism, and having really this, you know, two major agencies like UNHCR and IOM having really a coordination of, you know, the response, including, you know, what is needed, what is, I mean, there are more than 5.6 million people in need, and we're requesting $1.6 billion a year to address the most urgent needs. But you know, having this coordination, having more than 150 local and state level organizations has been crucial for me to understand where, you know, what are we addressing here? What are the gaps? What really can I offer the private sector and private philanthropy to really join forces? Because, you know, we have to have, I think the key word here, or the key component, is shared value. And, you know, we're not trying to force, you know, we need $1.5 billion, just give us to this big pot of money that we need. Is more about where can you make a difference, right? Where do we align in our values? Where do I also, as IOM, respond to your need of making an impact in the population that you want to invest? So that being said, I just wanted to say that from interests in the US philanthropy range from children, women, people with disabilities, youth, adults, mothers or expectant mothers. And so sometimes it's the reality is that the Venezuelan displacement comprises all of them, right? And we really need to see how we can help all of those people in need. So that was kind of the back comment, the context comment, to say, I want to be able to inform my trusted partner, or that one in the United States that is trusting me on where does their philanthropy makes more sense, more impact, and where can it add to. So when we discuss with many partners, but in particular with the Citi Foundation, they explained to us that they had a priority of really working with sustainable impact. They are looking for long-term impact. They're looking for income generation activities. They want to tackle like a short-term need, which is income generation, but how does that work in the long term? And if they invest in any of our programs, these migrants that have been supported initially can be actually employers and could generate opportunities and can hire more Venezuelans or more even from the local population, the local community. And so that was, the picture that Citi told me, I'm a bank, I'm about making money, I want people to succeed. So where is it? Where can we invest? And that's where, we had one of the big sectors of the Venezuela response is integration. And when we talk about integration, we're talking about socioeconomic integration. We're not just saying, we're going to help Venezuelans make money. We're going to tell them, but we are also going to address the very important issue of xenophobia and the negative narrative towards migrants, because they are being hosted by these wonderful communities that sometimes may have a different view about how aid is being distributed in these countries. So those two priorities, right? I want to support Citi Foundation, wanted to support income generation but they also wanted to support social cohesion. How do we make this an integral response? And with that, we can say that the Citi Foundation is our largest donor for the Venezuela response in IOM, and it has maintained its level. And I'm happy to say that we will continue to partner. So they wanted to work on three main components. This is very important because I think that it's sometimes it's easy to just say, well, we're supporting this program, but how? They said, I want capacity building and recognition of credentials to all those that can work in the sector that they know or they were working in Venezuela. How can we support them doing the same job in the country that they are living right now? That's one component: capacity, training, recognition of credentials. We have done a lot of work with doctors recognizing their credentials in Peru. The second component is seed capital. So from all of those that we were able to train, to work with, you know, who are those that really have the merit to go into the phase of creating seed capital? I wish we had seed capital for all of them, right? But we had to narrow it down and choose a really big pool of entrepreneurs in Colombia and Peru. The stories are amazing, and you can see them in our social media. Anybody that is listening here, USA for IOM, you can see the amazing videos and stories about resilience, about impact, about work every day. It's commendable. And the third component is awareness raising. And Mariela was referring to this, and I think it's very important because awareness raising is like awareness raising, right? Awareness raising is a poster on a street or a bus stop, but awareness raising is also, it's like making sure that the person in the community that these Venezuelans are working know that they are baking their bread, they are making their food, they are serving their restaurants, they're part of their community. And how do we do that? And how do we tackle those? So we have a lot of very innovative ways of connecting receiving communities with Venezuelans. And that's the third component that I think we are very happy that Citi Foundation invested, because raising awareness has to be tangible, has to have an outcome. And that's where I wanted to highlight. So sorry I took a little bit longer, but I think it's a very commendable effort, a leader on the field of philanthropy. And we just wanted to share that with you.
No, this is part of the objective, and the objective is part to show to the others that you can do your part in the process. And you give me the opportunity just to raise one point, which is really important. We need to work with the host communities. We need also to work not only for the regulatory bottlenecks that the migrants and refugees have to go to have access to the social services. We have to also to work with the non-regulatory bottlenecks, as the cognitive bias that we have. We need to work against xenophobic sentiments, and the best way just to work towards a more integrated process is always talking about social cohesion, which is including the host communities in the benefit. And when you hire a migrant and refugee, and it becomes part of the community, begin to pay taxes, for example, the process of integration is going to be a virtuous cycle. But why don't let's move to the question, because we have some questions here in the Q&A box. And Scarlett, William Vigil, from co-director of South North Nexus, I'm going to pass your address to Scarlett, and maybe you have maintained contact later on. But he answered is that if the organization working also not only the Venezuelan situation, for example, he's mentioned that the Nicaraguan, he's experienced also some movements to Costa Rica and other countries. And what is like, your scope in Latin America? I think it's good to know for all of us.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I think this goes for us globally. We have tended to focus on countries that are refugee hosting rather than source countries. I think there's a huge amount, obviously, of work that needs to also be done and support to be provided to the countries where we're seeing large, exoduses. So we think about Syria, we think about Venezuela, think about the Northern Triangle countries. That has not typically been our area of expertise, and we certainly don't want to take on things that we are not, well suited for. So we tend to focus on countries that are receiving large numbers of refugees and migrants. So, that could certainly be in Europe, in the US, especially as the Biden administration is welcoming, several thousand refugees over the next few years. We'll be doing a lot here. And in Latin America, that has typically been the countries that are most impacted by the Venezuelan crisis, as well as Mexico, which is of course seeing a spike in asylum applications, partially due to the US's policies, if not almost all due to the US's policies, if not of essentially closing the borders. However, having said that, the situation is so fluid. We are keeping a close eye on all of this. And Hamdi, our founder, has been asked by the vice president here in the US, Kamala Harris, to take a look at what the private sector can do in the Northern Triangle and countries like Nicaragua as well. So Tent is involved, and what we are mostly doing is providing kind of our best practices, expertise based on what we've seen from our work over the past 5 years and how it could be transferred. And we are, very open. I'd be very happy to have a chat with you offline, a little bit more about what this looks like. Very open to seeing where we can be helpful, but we are just also, I think, want to be respectful of other organizations that have more expertise on the ground in a country like Nicaragua, which we just don't have thus far.
Thank you, Scarlett. I think this is a very good resume of what are you doing in the region. But there are another question from Mr. Nicholas is if you have some examples about how you, from the Simon Bolivar Foundation or from the USA IOM, has regarding or towards the protection of migrant children. As we all know, the migrant children is one of the most vulnerable population. Do you have any example that maybe you are working in some part trying to protect or to help in the thing of the children, Mariela?
No, none of the programs that we have is regarding to protection of children. We do have programs that are related to nutrition. And in Colombia, for instance, we have, as I mentioned, we had a plan for providing meals to Venezuelan migrants, and that included families. The program was oriented to both the kind of like the permanent migrants, but also the ones that are the caminantes, the ones that are moving through Colombia. No? So the idea was to give them bags of food that they could carry for a couple of weeks. No, but I don't know. I think I saw Scarlett was nodding, so I don't know if she has any idea or any project that they're doing.
No, no. I mean, I would just say to that that question, I think that there would be, several very worthy organizations, both within the UN system and smaller social enterprises, NGOs that are, again, the experts in terms of making sure that that migrants who are children have access to education, to health, to social services. And I would just assume it would be very contextualized based on the country and the town in terms of what exactly is most needed. But I do think Maria is probably better suited than I am to answer this question. I will turn it over to her.
Thank you, Maria. Do you have any idea?
Just so very quickly, not in the framework of the Venezuela response, but certainly Venezuelans are the largest, I would say, or one of the largest migration groups in the hemisphere. Last year during COVID, or our COVID appeal, we received corporate contributions to earmark towards children and how can we help alleviate the challenges that were imposed by COVID-19 and their access to education. So this is where we did, again, with philanthropy, this time from City Corporate, not the City Foundation, but from the corporate side and many other very large partners, we were able to help migrant families to access education for their kids, their children, through the distribution of tablets, and we had designed some programs also for early education, as their parents were trying to also sustain their livelihood, right, working from home, and having kids don't miss on their education. So this is a very interesting work that we see that migrant families were in particularly vulnerable in some countries and in some sub-regions of this hemisphere. Actually, migrant children have no access to school. So even in non-COVID scenario, right, like they are not legally accepted to go to school. So I am thinking that, you know, protection also goes with education, right? If we keep our children in education enrolled, less vulnerable to I would say to have their protection or their, you know, to be vulnerable. So yeah, that's a work that we've been doing with corporations, where they saw the need to also pair technology and access to remote education.
Thank you. I think it's, and just to be fair, there are here some very good examples, but there are a lot of companies, there are a lot of organizations around the region that are working in this process, helping the governments, helping the migrants, and helping the host communities. And this is just an example of that, but you can go deeper if you go to the webpage of any of these organizations, even to IOM or even to the IDB, and you can find more examples how they work. Mariela, just maybe to begin to close the conclusions here, how do you see the future? How do you envision what is the next steps from your work, from the foundation? What else you can do in the future?
Well, I think that in general terms, we see that stakeholders all around the world are being more challenging more the private sector about working with ESG elements, no, environmental, social, and governance. So organizations are moving towards having a larger impact in general terms. I think that for the foundation as such, we see that last year we demonstrated that we could, with the change of the mission, we could have an impact on a larger number of individuals. And what we're trying to do is to implement programs that will have an impact in Venezuela and in the region. It's not easy. We see that there is a lot of challenges in especially implementing programs in Venezuela, but that doesn't deter us from doing it. We will continue to find ways to support the Venezuelans in and out of Venezuela. And we will be issuing our first annual report ever later this week. It will be in our webpage, but I think it will be good to show the work that we have done this year, and also show the hope that we have for the years to come, where we can create a larger impact in the Venezuelan group.
It will be very helpful, Mariela. Thank you, Maria. You work in IOM and you have the worldwide perspective, because there are another migration crisis in the world. What is your advice? I mean, for this audience, how we can maintain the awareness about what is happening in the Latin American region, and specifically into Venezuela crisis? What are two ideas that how we can maintain the awareness? How we can work together to try to maintain the attention to this?
Yes, it's a very complex question. Unfortunately, I don't think that crises are going to stop appearing. I've been working many other regions. I've worked in Africa and the Mediterranean, and I see that the problems sometimes, or the challenges, repeat, right? And actually they're cross-regional. They just vary a little bit more. What I've seen is, so that's a challenge, right? And unfortunately, I don't know if it's a kind of a negative way of me saying, like, we're not going to have less crisis, but I also want to recognize that there is more awareness now. There is more ways to partner. There is increased, I would say, the private sector, civil society, philanthropy, they see their role. They see they are part of the response. I think we've moved, no, like even from the very beginnings of philanthropy from Aristotle and, 2000 years ago with, even biblical references, we've evolved until like a world that we have today of how and how can I make it an impact and a difference. So I saw a question, so I want to tap into that because we have climate change, in the top of our list. We have displacement, migration. How about I will quote our former Director General, Mr. Swing, who rests in peace. He passed last month. He said, "How about if we start seeing migration as something that we have to work with instead of seeing it as a problem? Migration can be managed if we all work together to do this. And how do we start seeing this as problems, but so more as opportunities?" And that's where I want to say that the private sector has also committed to work on the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's no longer, the responsibility of a certain stakeholder group. It's the responsibility of private sector to be part of that attainment and reducing all of those challenges that we have. So from IOM, USA for IOM side, what we can say is we will work together to have an informed or to inform our partners in the best way they can contribute to the attainment of the SDGs and the alleviation of all the crises.
Okay. If we don't have the time just to answer all the questions, of course, with the organizer, we are going to collect them and trying to answer them via email. And Scarlett, do you have any final thoughts? What are your next steps for TEN in the region? What do you think? What do you envision for strengthening your really good work?
Yes. Well, I think one of the great things about working for a successful CEO and entrepreneur is that the ambitions are large, but we're really here to support companies. And I should say we do everything we do at no cost. There's no ask financially of businesses that we work with. Hamdi's mission really is to get as many businesses involved and helping refugees integrate economically into their new communities. That's our sole purpose. So I would love to just say to any businesses listening in today that have a presence in the region, whether it's in Colombia or Peru or Mexico or all of these countries, that there really is a very meaningful and practical step that you can take by thinking about hiring Venezuelans or hiring others who are displaced or buying from refugee businesses. Or if you're a bank, could you also think about adjusting or modifying your own procedures to make it easier for those who are not able to necessarily, let's say, prove their credit to still be able to take out a credit line. So there's just so many options, and we at TEN are here to work with you. So please do get in touch if you're interested. We could only do what we do with the amazing support and work of basically everybody else as well. So from IOM to UNHCR to local NGOs, there's a very, very strong ecosystem in the region that I think is well set up to support the business community in kind of doing its part to support the displacement crisis that we're seeing. So thank you for having me, and really enjoyed learning from the other panelists.
No, thank you for your participation. And I used to say that we don't need policies specific for migrants. We need to include migrants in the public policies, and as well in the opportunity from the private sector. Right? It's a good business, it's the ethical mandate, but it's an economic opportunity. I'm going to pass the voice to Michael. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Michael, if you want to make some concluding remarks, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mariela, Maria, Scarlett, and Felipe. This has been a splendid conversation. You've outlined the kind of positive, realistic activities that a great many others, governments, private firms, individuals should emulate. Felicitaciones. And please keep us informed on your progress, all of you. Thanks also to our hardworking association team for making every event possible, Lina Delgado, Linda Calvet, and Lauri Dominguez. We have several exciting programs in the works, and we'll let you know when the details are confirmed. We will also let you all know about our plans to transition from COVID to post-COVID later this year. We are particularly interested in maintaining the wider audience achieved through virtual programming. The word hybrid is part of the new vocabulary of this year. And we're not talking about flowers. By the way, if any of you tuning in have ideas of how we should make that transition, of whom we should invite, of what we should be focusing on, please let us know. And if you are not already a member of the Venezuelan American Association, please consider joining. You may contact our team via the invitation. Thank you again all for participating. We look forward to meeting with you again soon.